I spent a few days in Florida back in August to help the Unitarian Church, where Bishop Spong and I will be holding a conference next month to get their planning kick-started. And some members of the committee were trying to figure out why a guy who is not a Unitarian was being brought in to organize them and to conduct an educational event for them. One fairly skeptical gentleman politely asked, why, if you are a progressive pastor, do you still call your church a Christian church, and why do you still include communion in your services? And I don't typically like to answer a question with a question, but in this case it seemed to fit. So I asked him, why do you call your church a Unitarian Universalist church, when Unitarian means you don't believe in the Trinity, you believe in the unity of God, when in fact you no longer have a doctrine of the nature of a theistic God. And Universalist means you believe that everyone goes to heaven, and you guys don't believe that there's a heaven. The name Unitarian Universalist no longer accurately describes what that denomination really stands for, but the name has been around for generations, and there's not presently a compellingly better option to make them want to change. And the same is more or less the true for us. We started our church 8 years ago, and though even from the very beginning we had some Jewish and Buddhist and atheist participants, for the most part we were a band of former Protestants and Catholics, and we named ourselves based on the preponderance of our experience in 2008. Though our Sunday morning services have continued to evolve, we started out pretty much at the same point where we had left our previous Christian traditions. We never wiped the slate clean, but we're not making any firm promises about what we're going to call ourselves or how we will conduct our services 5 years from now. Realistically, we are a product of our culture and the influences that we have chosen to help shape our present and our future. This is how religion, this is how language, this is how politics and music and art all work. As Carl Sagan is famous for saying, if you want to make an apple pie from scratch, first you have to create a universe. All of us work with what we have at hand, with the ingredients that we've got, with the language that we know, with the images that we are familiar. So that being said, today we have heard this reading, thank you Mark, from this very familiar story from the Gospel of John, in which Jesus turns 150 gallons of water into excellent wine, literally turning a wedding feast into a kind of Mardi Gras celebration. Folks, that's a lot of wine. I like wine, but that's a lot of wine. So what do we make of this story? And let me get the most obvious thing out of the way immediately. It didn't happen. If you go to Israel today, on the Sea of Galilee, there's an archaeological dig that they say is Capernaum, and there's an Orthodox church that's got the 6 stone jars that Jesus turned water into wine, and then there's a Catholic church that also has the original 6 jars. But regardless of the architecture and the claims being made by the churches at the time, it didn't happen. John is not the least bit interested in giving us a literal history, and he's not concerned about the fact that he is making up this event whole cloth. He is creating a narrative for theological reasons, not for history. He is telling us something that is a sermon. It's a message. And here you may have to just trust me a bit, at least until you have time to go and research it for yourself. John is writing after the other 3 Gospels in the New Testament have become fairly well known, at least in some version. He borrows from the previous works when it suits him, and he very liberally edits them when it suits him. He enhances the previous works to guide the evolution of the early Christian movement in the West in the early part of the 2nd century. So 70, 80 years after Jesus was dead, 50 years after these Gospels are written, John is written probably from Rome, probably in Italy, to guide the future of the church. You can't really claim that any of the Gospels are firmly rooted in Palestine, but the other three do deal a bit more closely with the Jewish elements of the faith of Jesus and the disciples. John is written at a greater distance, with greater disdain for all things Jewish. Though John shares many parts of the gospel narrative with the other three, one of the important differences is there is no Last Supper scene in John. There is no clear precedent for communion in the Gospel of John, which is an odd thing, especially when you consider the fact that Paul, the first writer in the Christian tradition, Paul virtually never mentions the historical Jesus, has no interest in the history of Jesus, except for when it comes to communion. And he stops dead cold in his first letter to the church in Corinth and describes in detail how the Last Supper took place with Jesus and his disciples, and insists that the church in Corinth must observe communion precisely this way, the right way, which was Paul's way. I understand completely how he thinks about that. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke follow Paul's narrative to the T, only pausing to embellish the story along the way. John doesn't mention it at all. Is that because he wanted to root out the practice of communion in the evolving church? Most scholars don't think that was what he was doing. In fact, in some ways, he raises the ante a bit with this long high priestly prayer towards the end of John that's connected to a miraculous feeding of the multitudes, and he ends it all by telling the crowd that they must literally eat his flesh and drink his blood if they want to inherit the kingdom. A quote that sent the Catholic Church cascading down a theological wormhole for 2,000 years. In a more subtle way, this account of turning water into wine is also kind of a communion story. Again, every culture, every movement, every author uses the images and words that they have at hand. The first gospel writers used fairly familiar Jewish imagery to interpret the significance of Jesus' sacrifice. So they cast him as the lamb that is sacrificed at the Passover, changing the Passover itself from an annual Jewish observance into a weekly Christian observance. John borrowed the more familiar Greek and Roman image of the god of wine. In the Roman tradition, he was called Bacchus. And the temple of Bacchus featured a little priestly sleight of hand in which gathered worshipers once a year before the Bacchanal feast would be gathered, and the priest would open the doors to this small temple, and there's this huge vat. And everyone gets to watch the priest fill the vat with water. And then they close the doors and dance and sing and have rituals through the night. And the next morning they open the doors and the vat is full of wine. And the Bacchanal feast begins. What they don't want the laity to know is that there were tubes in the bottom of the vat that drained the water, and then little seep holes at the top that rained down rain to fill the vat during the night. But that was an image that they were all quite familiar with. So John pulls that in and places a kind of turning water into wine story into the Jesus tradition and suggests that it's part of the narrative of Jesus. Wine is a year-round luxury for the rich, but for the poor, it was an exception. For the poor, wine was part of the harvest festival. When grapes are gathered and the process of making wine is in full swing, everybody gets a taste. John doesn't call the turning of water into wine a miracle. He calls it a sign. If it's a sign, what is it a sign of? And that's the real crux of the matter here. That's why John includes it in the narrative at all. Most of the time, the poor deal with scarcity. John takes the wine from the communion table, turns it into jars holding 150 gallons of wine, and tells everyone this is a sign of the coming of the kingdom, when there's no difference between the rich and the poor, when everyone gets their fill. Several years ago, if I may shift images, several years ago, I took a team of church members down to Ecuador to a tiny remote village in the Andes Mountains, Cumbres Conde. And we had contributed $7,000 or $8,000 to buy the building materials, and we were helping to build a community center next to their Protestant church that had running water where they could wash their clothes. And one of the problems in those areas is they wash their clothes in an open stream, and that's where they get cholera, and there's all kinds of... So we built a building that had a kind of concrete laundromat and had rooms that could be locked where they could store their grain safely off the ground with a concrete floor and a locking door. Now, of course, when I was raising money for this project in the United States, I told everyone we were building a Sunday school building because building a building to store grain and wash clothes doesn't always make sense in a big denominational church, and I'm going to assume forgiveness for whatever mild deception was involved in that. I'm trusting they taught some Sunday school classes while they were storing grain. Agriculture in the high Andes doesn't make anyone rich or fat. The people there needed all the help they could get to make their largely bean and grain diet keep them alive. At the end of our week's work, the villagers wanted to have a big festival for us. There were not many chairs in the village, not many plates, not many forks, so they seated me and my team in the middle of their church with what chairs and tables they had, and the villagers all either stooped or sat on the floor in a circle behind us. And in front of us was a huge platter of fried chicken that had probably been made by killing every chicken in that village earlier that morning. And there was rice and beans and corn and tortillas and cups of Kool-Aid. I don't know how they get Kool-Aid, but they've got Kool-Aid everywhere down there. And we were hungry. Not many of us, folks, I didn't go to college because I wanted to do construction work. I went to college because I specifically didn't want to do manual labor. So none of us on that particular team were really used to doing manual labor all week long, and we were hungry. But as we filled our plates and started to eat, we noticed that the villagers were either not eating, and the few that were eating literally had some rice and beans in their shirt tails. They were eating with their fingers out of their shirt tails, and none of the children were eating. And once we realized that the chicken was only for the North Americans, none of us could eat. I mean, it was just immediately humiliating. And it was a full 30 minutes of the 10 or 12 of us trying to convince them that we didn't want the chicken. We were full. We couldn't eat it. Please eat it yourself. Share it among you. They were so accustomed to giving the best to the white people in the room and to do without themselves and to let their children eat the scraps that they literally couldn't conceive of doing otherwise. If only I had known what was going to happen that day, I would have brought so many chickens to Cumbres Conde that they would still be picking white feathers out of their hair and beards. But I didn't know. We had given them a small building that for a church, that the church that folks on the internet need to understand, we're meeting in what used to be a little kingdom hall. This building is valued at about $350,000. But at the time, I was the pastor of a church that was valued at about $9 million. And we had spent $8,000 to build this building. And they wanted to thank us for that by killing every source of eggs and protein that they had in their village to show their gratitude to us. That was the saddest day of my life. Artistically, symbolically, in a literary way, John put in the starting of his gospel a view of communion that breaks down the walls between the hoarders and the hungry, between the powerful and the weak, between those who live in abundance and those who have to survive the challenges of scarcity every day of their lives. So if I still think of myself as a Christian, if I still stand at the communion table softly saying to each person in line, the bread of life, it is because these are the images, this is the language of the church where I discovered the faith that teaches me to long for justice, that makes me hope for a day when everybody has an equal place at the table, that makes me have faith in the ability of people to change, to make the world a more loving and fair place. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.